So, Ian, of all the places in the world right now, you're in Oklahoma, and
That is correct.
I think many people are wondering why Oklahoma. And ironically,
Incredible
my name's
technology,
Boomer, so it's just and
incredible
I
technology and culture.
there you go,
So
there you go.
it was a familial decision. My wife's family was getting older, and she wanted to be closer to them. And we had been living in Austin for going on 2 decades, and the option of being there or being here, to me, my preference was Austin, but the kids didn't really get to be kids. Everyone was kind of a programmed young adult, and in our particular neighborhood, everybody had a starter castle with a giant, gate around it and wall and fence, and it was, I don't know, that wasn't so thrilling to me. I think the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of my decision was a little kid called and said that he wanted to schedule a play date with my son, who was 8 at the time, for like 2 weeks from Tuesday. And I just remember thinking, that is an issue. That's,
Yeah, yeah.
ride your bike over to the house, do something, like a normal small child. But yeah,
Yeah, you
nowadays,
shouldn't at 8 years old have a Google Calendar out, right?
that's right. Yeah, Calendly at 8. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Very, very cool. And so you're adapting to the Oklahoma culture. Have you chosen which side of the Red River shootout you want to be a part of?
Yeah, actually, I've had kids go to both OU and OSU. So of the two, my preference is OSU.
Hmm.
Though I really am kind of, ambivalent on the whole topic. But if I had to pick one, I actually think it's nicer. Just, I know the one that I'm not terribly partial to has a much larger endowment, and seemingly has kind of a better technical side, but the other just has a better vibe. And really, in truth, for me, if the options are more money or better vibe, I will 100% of the time go with better vibe.
Ah, this is why you and I get along so fantastically well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very, very true. Given your background, that's very true, obviously.
So, Ian, the one of the things we want to get into today is, of course, ozone. But for somebody, look, I've had the pleasure of talking to you many times, but your background is, from my understanding, more in chemistry. But how does one become interested in that? Because I remember taking like eighth grade chemistry, AP chemistry, whatever it was, and then it kind of faded away. But what sort of drew you into this world, if you will?
I was very good at it in high school. I was just kind of gifted. I had initially I had a little bit of an issue with it, but then I had a tutor who just took me to his lab and explained everything. And once I saw how everything was actually going to be utilized, then I thought, okay, this makes perfect sense. So then from that point on, I just crushed it.
Hmm.
And it was what I actually wanted to do at the time, was to do environmental cleanups. My real goal was not to do applied chemistry or anything like that. It was actually to do just things that would benefit the environment. And so my two big interests were chemistry and music. And I went to school. I had a chemistry scholarship, but I also had a music scholarship, and I studied
What
chemistry,
instrument?
saxophone.
Oh, really? I didn't realize you're a
Yeah.
saxophone player. Okay.
Oh
I
yeah.
try I
Yeah.
tried that for like a couple of weeks and that didn't work out so well with my sports career at the time. So,
No, it's great, man. That was actually, I think that informed a lot of the ways that I actually looked at molecular interaction, was through
mm,
music. Because in kind of the last analysis, everything really isn't, how things bond ionically, and, all that sort of stuff, ligands and biochem and things like that. I don't really think they're actually the crux of it. I think you're kind of missing the point if that's where you focus. It's really all about how things balance in terms of elegance, for harmonics and frequencies. And that
mhm.
ultimately, it's kind of funny because I abandoned a lot of the constructs that I was taught, and they never intuitively felt quite right.
Mhm.
And then I saw some work by the fellow named Walter Russell,
Mhm.
and just thought it was brilliant. The moment I saw it, he had an entirely different periodic table of the elements. We all use the Mendeleev periodic table, and
Yeah.
Walter Russell wrote his own. And I looked at it and intuitively knew that it was completely right. And it literally, it's the only thing, that I keep on the wall in terms of a reference at the lab, because it's brilliant. And when you look at it, when you look at compounds in terms of how they actually function, in
Hmm.
lieu of grouping flowers together because they're all the same color, that's really not not the best way to do it. I mean, if you're trying to go through some sort of ontology and group things and figure out how things are structured, sometimes the way they appear, though they share commonalities, is not the most truly accurate way to do it. And
Hmm.
when you start looking at frequency responses and things moving harmonically, that's a more effective way to do it. And so Walter Russell's setup was just that. It was looking at harmonics and nodal interaction. And it's funny because all of the representations you see are two-dimensional, but the whole thing, when I look at it, it's like music. It's all three-dimensional, and it's kind of spheres interrelating with other spheres and the dynamic interaction. I mean, it's all effectively waveforms and how they propagate and interact. And it's just like a hologram.
Hmm.
So, when I look at things, I get an intuitive sense of how to do some sort of recombinant process with them. And so far, it seems to work out pretty well.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
So you went from environmental cleanup to applied chemistry. What got you interested in the whole health side of things?
Actually, so it was a bit of a circuitous path, really. I went from environmental cleanups to music, and then I decided that I just wanted to be a professional saxophonist all the time.
Hmm.
So I did
Uh,
that.
I do too, but I'm just not talented enough.
Well, I moved from New Orleans, where I grew up. I went to school in Mississippi, and then I went back and studied at the University of New Orleans with a guy named Ellis Marsalis, who's a real,
It
like,
explains why you're a saxophone player, though. Yeah.
yeah, actually, well, yeah, and I was third generation, right? So
Hmm.
in my family, my mom is still actually a blues singer around New Orleans. So,
Wow.
yeah, which is pretty cool. When we go to visit her, sometimes she'll have to bolt and go, "Grandma has a gig," and split. But I played in her band when I was younger, and really my options were either really work at it diligently and be very good, or just simply not do it.
Hmm.
So I put a fair amount of focus into it, and then I moved to Austin. And I was, when I moved there, I was voted the best new jazz artist in Austin. There was a big competition for it, the Clarksville Jazz Fest. And so I was making strides, but the problem was I never really clicked in terms of sort of the lifestyle of a musician. I like staying up late, but I also like getting up obnoxiously early. And so I'm very curious. And so when I was playing professionally, I didn't really have much to do during the days. And so I was talking to my dad, who at the time was working as, I think he was an expert on the Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species or something at that moment, and then became an archaeologist, an anthropologist, and a professor. He's just kind of, he's very bright, so he adapts pretty rapidly to whatever he's curious about. And I was talking to him, and he said, why don't you just do, like construction or something during the day, like you did when you were in school? And I thought, oh, that'd be great. I can do music at night and then do construction during the day. So I got a job as a handy dandy carpenter, and it became incredibly apparent that if you have your wits about you and you're smart, you actually show up on time and aren't drunk, that you've ousted roughly 90% of the competition. So in the span of literally about 6 months, I went from just doing carpentry to being, in charge of an entire subdivision, which was kind of a meteoric sort of movement in terms of managerial ability. But, it is what it is. And so then I thought, this is fun. Maybe I'll do architecture. So I started doing architecture and designed a bunch of buildings around Austin. And then I built a resort called the Lake Austin Spa Resort, where I was the director of design and construction, in charge of all the architecture, engineering, contracting, everything. And I studied. I was curious about all of it. I mean, I legitimately loved it. And then I started doing real estate development, and then building tons of houses and condos and things like that around Austin. And then I had amassed a pretty vast portfolio, and then everything imploded around 2008, 2009. And
Yeah, like everything did in 2008, 2009.
and I found myself having been the beneficiary of not really thinking it through so clearly. I continually kept going all in. And so I was very much without the vast amount of money that I had set aside at that point, because I kept rolling in and thinking, it'll turn. And
Yeah.
it didn't turn, shockingly. In retrospect, you make those choices and go, wow, that was not the smartest move in the world.
Hmm.
But I was looking at my retirement portfolio and I thought, God, I'm going to have to work forever to just make that back. And I was looking at it and I ran the numbers out to 70 years and I thought, God, it's not so hot. But then I'm kind of a math nerd. So I ran it out to 90 years and thought, well, that looks not so shabby. And then just for grins, I ran it out to 110 years and thought, wow, that would be fantastic. I could basically do whatever I wanted. And then I thought, okay, so really the question at hand here is I just need to be able to live to 130 without any biological degradation. And then I'm set. And literally, and that was kind of the thing. And I literally thought, well, I'm oddly well tooled to crack that egg, so I'll do that. And so then I started doing a lot of nanoparticulate work and kind of fell back into the chemistry side of things and started doing some work. And I had done things in the meantime. I had developed a lab on chip assay system for Chem 20 and stuff like that, and patented, small scale spectroscopic equipment in the midst of doing all the other stuff. So I never really let it stop and die out. I just kind of pushed it to the back burner. But when I started thinking, okay, I need to figure out this whole, not aging biological degradation thing, I just jumped in full force and started working on carbon 60
Hmm.
and really did a deep dive into nanoparticulate, and then found that it made perfect sense to me. And so I started doing some patents, and then I started doing research with longevity, and my lab animals, I was able to extend their lifespan 93% beyond the normal point. And I was using a thing called P53 knockouts, where you extract the P53 tumor suppressor gene. And because they're the unfortunate cancer rats, they idiopathically produce tumors, so they just pop up all over, and they're the ones you always see with the unfortunate bulbous tumors everywhere. And
Hmm.
they have very defined mortality curves, though, which is why it was of interest to me, because I was working on an inflammatory response, and I figured with an older creature, as they biologically start to degrade, then you should see a cytokine response flare up much more rapidly, and you should be able to isolate things for inflammatory responses. And that's what I was actually working on. So I used those guys, but the benefit kind of thereafter that I didn't really know going into it was because they had such well-defined mortality curves. I was able to look back and go, these guys should not have lived nearly this long. And so they lived 93% longer on average than they should have, and they didn't have tumors. And
Hmm.
so when I did the first necropsy on the first rat, it had died of a femoral hemorrhage. And I thought, well, maybe I'm just missing something, since I don't, spend my day doing veterinary necropsies, right? So I
Hmm.
sent the next off to a vet pathologist to make sure that it was accurate, and there was no incidence of cancer. And then the third, and then it just kept happening like that. And then we'd find slightly anomalous things in the tissues, but nothing that was actually overtly cancerous, and none of them died from cancer. They all died of old age, with the
Hmm.
one dying from femoral hemorrhage. And it was just very perplexing. But that was kind of it sort of pushed me way ahead of the curve in terms of looking at longevity and responses on inflammatory markers like cytokines. I was able to figure out how to negate the cytokine response, which ameliorates all sorts of issues in terms of autoimmune conditions and other things like that. So I really got very deep into the applied research on carbon nanoparticles, and did a lot of patents, and developed an anti-metastatic serum to inhibit the metastasis of cancer, and then serums to regrow hair and all sorts of stuff that prior to really looking at those molecules, there were a lot of intractable issues. But after you start adding tools to the toolkit, suddenly, like, wow, look, I have a screwdriver. What can I do with this?
Yeah.
So I started tinkering with that, and that led to a conversation with Dave Asprey, from Bulletproof, because my research started to catch a little notoriety about the longevity effects that I was getting. And then after that, I really kind of jumped into the biohacker space. I'd actually, on the note of Bulletproof, I had never done coffee, like, in my entire life. And
Even with that sleep schedule, you never did coffee once.
no, I
Wow.
meditated. Yeah, I meditated a ton, and was like a avid vegetarian. Like, I actually haven't had meat for, I guess, 27 years now. which
Well,
normally I don't actually recommend because I don't think it's the healthiest diet style. I
hmm
actually think, something like pescatarian or doing grass-fed meats is actually way better for you. But just my whole thing was trying to find ways to keep myself mentally clear and just looking for acuity. And
hmm
so to that end, I had just gone through and systemically eliminated things in my diet that I thought were slowing me down. And I had never done any sort of stimulant like that. Occasionally I'd have black tea or something, but that was it. And then I heard Dave Asprey talking on a kind of an obscure podcast in 2013 and thought, huh, the biochem on that makes sense. I'll check that out. So, and personally, I thought coffee was awful at the time. Fast
Phew.
forward,
Okay,
fast
finally
forward.
something you and I don't agree on. Okay.
Well, okay. So fast forward 8 years, and I sucked the stuff down like nobody's business. But it was one of those things where I thought, okay, I remember actually at the time I bought all the stuff, and then I had some grass-fed Kerrygold butter, and then I got the brain octane oil, and I started blending it up. And I actually have my notebooks where I was doing journaling exactly what I was doing as an experiment every morning starting in June of 2013. And after I started taking it, I thought, oh my god, this stuff's fantastic. Who knew? And obviously everyone knew that coffee, not shockingly, was really great.
hmm
But that's it was just a shock to me. And so I have since constantly doing coffee all the time now.
Good.
But it's funny. I started doing it because the biochem made sense, and it really did. And it was palpable too. When you took it, you could feel it. And so I
Mm.
just got more and more kind of into the whole biohacking thing, and then started looking at different ways that I could apply, either compounds that I was developing or chemicals that I was developing, or in some cases, mechanistic things like neural responses from TDCS units I build for myself. I was always trying to optimize things, right?
hmm
So, one time I spent a couple months really doing a deep dive into nootropics because I wanted to be really, really kind of at the cutting edge mentally, and I didn't feel like I was quite there. So I was tracking my mental performance on the Cambridge Brain Sciences website, and
hmm
at the time there were about 77,800 people on the site constantly tracking mental performance. So pretty good, but I could never exceed the 83rd percentile when I would do the battery of tests. And so I spent a couple months really drilling down into nootropics, and then I ordered all this stuff. And at the time, I just built the TDCS unit to try and kind of upregulate the pace of the potentiation, neural potentiation for the signaling. And
hmm
then I did all these hardcore nootropics, and I went back, and it was a Sunday morning, and I took the battery of tests again and just crushed it. And I remember literally it was kind of peculiar, and I've read a lot since then, and other people have had this experience where your actual color perception shifts, from things
hmm
like polaраcetam. And so one of the compounds it was phenylpiracetam,
Yeah.
and oh my god, it was phenomenal.
hmm
I literally felt like the lights came on.
hmm
And then I took the entire battery of test and maxed it. Well, at least myself and I think three other people had ever scored that high, and it was easy. And that was the thing. And then everything down regulated. It was kind of akin to the effect that you get if you do a nasal shot of vasopressin, where you
hmm
can just suddenly memorize 200 Chinese characters in one shot with 100% accuracy that you've never looked at before. It's that kind of the beauty that there's so much untapped potential that we
Yeah.
have that we never really delve into. And
Mm.
so I actually, because my dad, our mutual friend Ted is a really brilliant guy, and my dad is one of the other guys who's kind of got that sort of one of the highest IQs in the world. And because of that, I was always around that as a kid, and it was always a little daunting. So I was always trying to, honestly, just trying to keep up, and never really thought that I'd be able to. So I was always kind of pushing the bounds to see what I could do to try and pace up a little bit.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, now I have to keep up with both you and Ted, so it's always keeping me on my toes, that's for sure. Uh, Ian, so somebody like you, when you look at your projects, and I've seen the mind map, right? But when you look at what projects to take on and
Yeah.
how you approach problems? Is it a question that somebody brings to you typically? Does it all fall under this one theme of longevity and living to 130 because retirement becomes so much easier then? Or is it like, how do you start to filter out what works or what interests you and what doesn't?
Well, when I opened my lab I guess actually 8 years ago now, when I opened the lab, I wrote down 6 things on the board that I wanted to solve before I died. And so it was aging, cancer, clean water, global warming, superluminal travel, and free energy. And those were the ones that I wanted to knock out. And I figured if I could knock those out, then I would make a big dent for humanity, right? Kind of heal things a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, to that end, anything that sort of falls in the structure of those under the umbrella of one of those, then I generally try and do it. Or if someone's doing something that I feel is really noble and they're trying to help people and heal people, or heal the planet or something like that, I'm all in.
Hmm.
And because I do have a bit of a peculiar skill set, and I think it's because I have such a varied background in terms of I'm not really a specialist. As fate would have it, I do seem to be pretty adept at picking things up quickly,
Hmm.
so I can learn enough to actually navigate through most things. But it's just a matter of, does it ethically align with what I'm trying to do? And the overarching theme really isn't longevity. The longevity was just, the more I got into it, it was just something that was it got me moving in the right direction. But the farther I got into it, the more I realized this is where it feels right to be. And so there was kind of a peculiar alignment between, my brain and my heart. And when that all synced up, that was kind of the magic. When I was doing things that I was passionate about, where I felt it would help people. The projects as of late, the first one was obviously aging, and the 130-year thing, that was just at a first blush. And it actually, at 93% for a normal male in the US, that would work out to about 152.
Hmm.
And that was, and honestly, I think that's very easily doable. Since then, I've looked at things like, Shia Faradi's work in Israel, where he's showing, retrograde effects and telomeres. And, when you get, your telomerase kicked in and your telomeres start moving in retrograde and actually lengthening, that's pretty amazing.
Hmm.
But that said, just as a quick digression, the idea of just living to a 93% extension, I've way blown past that at this point. I mean, that was 6-7 years ago now. So at this point, I would be shocked if the idea of living anything less than 300 or 400% longer than normal lifespan is where I would actually settle, because the science says that it's there. It's funny because people oftentimes ask me, like, well, you don't have any data back that supports that. I have some animal data, but all of the data I have in people is just, from watching the beneficial effects of the lack of degradation or the reparations to their system,
Hmm.
where they become more mobile and more mentally astute and things like that. So yeah, the longevity thing, just a small component.
Hmm.
Really, I mean, like you said, you've seen the mind map of what I'm working on. Projects where I feel people like, a non-addictive opioid, or anxiolytics, or quantum shielding for gamma rays, things that I think, will fall into the category of one of those 6 things. One of the big projects that I just did was a carbon negative concrete.
Hmm.
And so it extracts carbon or concrete generally accounts for about 8% of the annual CO2 burden.
Hmm.
And so I was asked to come up with a way to see if I could do a carbon neutral concrete. And I made a carbon neutral concrete, but then I thought, this was pretty simple. I bet I could beat this. So I went back and rejiggered the chemistry a bit, and I was able to end up with negating the 8% and then pulling out another 24%. So a net reduction of 32%. And obviously, it's not going to be ubiquitously adopted
Hmm.
across the entire planet. But if all of the concrete went to this, then suddenly there'd be a 32% reduction in the annual greenhouse gas emissions,
Hmm.
which, going back to my list, fell under the category of, things to worry about in terms of
Global
global warming.
warming. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the cancer stuff, I'd say that's not quite a done deal. But in terms of metastatic spread, yeah, I knocked that out. And so oddly, you'd think that would be a bigger thing that would have caught, a fair amount of press, but it really seems to go unnoticed. But granted, that's a giant industry. And I think I don't really want to tangle or stand up and scream, ah!
Yeah.
Look here, pay attention, because it's, that's the kind of thing that people just get destroyed by, crushed by an industry like that. And then
Hmm.
the other things, I really think space travel is going to be kind of pivotal. So I've worked a fair amount on that, developed a new ionic propulsion system, and then gamma shielding, using fluxons and some other things. And because some of the components that are missed are, the moment you move out of the magnetosphere, gamma rays are just going to eviscerate your gut biome.
Hmm.
And if you make it to Mars and you set up a colony there, that's great, but you're going to be just very genetically distorted.
Challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want, like people have a poster of a thalidomide baby and go, oh my gosh, they were so healthy, and if you completely destroy a human's genetics, and then you start having kids in some distant remote world, things are probably not going to go so well. So
Hmm.
that was one of the things I wanted to take out was, looking at if that's the next move for humanity to make sure that we're safe, how do you do that?
Hmm.
So one of the simple things was gamma shielding, in an efficient way. I mean, there are other guys who've worked on gamma shielding, but nobody had anything that was really solid. So I developed an elegant system to do it. And then propulsion, the idea of strapping yourself to a bottle rocket is just not terribly well thought out. I
No.
mean, I appreciate that it's the approach that everybody's used since Werner von Braun, but not the best tech really, and it's just not a terribly good approach. I mean, because we discussed it, kind of what I developed to
Hmm.
negate that as a necessity. I just want to move the needle. And so really going back to the question prior to my tangential approach to everything, I just want to help, man. I really do legitimately want to move the needle. And I figure if I'm lucky and I actually take my own medicine and do hopefully what I'm trying to do, then I've got a couple hundred years to play with to make a difference. So that's what I'm
Amazing.
going to do. Yeah.
All right, Ian, where does ozone fit into this equation, and how did you become interested in ozone?
Okay, so a friend of mine, Bobby Dillard, has a real estate company that I really like. He structured everything very well, and I admire the way he put it together. It's a really brilliant organization. And we were talking, and he needed to come up with a way in early 2020 to be able to have his daycares open up at all of his different facilities, that were clean and disinfected. So we started looking at things like UV lighting and looking at UVC, and trying to come up with ways to clean the space. But the issue with UV lights is that unless it's in a direct line of contact, or primarily direct line of contact, when you do get some wave interaction, but with the actual light, you're not going to be able to knock out a virus or anything like that. So then we started pondering ozone, and then we're both biohackers, so we looked at it, and Bobby said, "Now I wonder if we could just make this an ozone treatment. Kind of if we could replace, say, like autohemotherapy, which is, I don't know if you've ever done autohemotherapy, but it's a really cool thing to do. You extract a, maybe 100 mils of blood, and then you inject ozone into it.
So
And
this
the
would be like
ozone,
10 pass or something like that?
yeah, that's basically, yeah, it is like 10 pass, but it's a single pass.
Okay.
So 10 passes, you're literally doing it in multiples, but this is a single pass of the 10 pass.
Hmm.
And so you extract your blood, you mix the ozone, and the ozone's about the third most reactive chemical species. So there are 100 million molecular interactions in a second. And so when you put the blood in a bag and you hit it with the ozone, you actually see it change color, and you mix it up a little bit, and it turns this generally much prettier, lighter color. And then you reintroduce it in your system. Um, and you get all the benefits of the stabilized ozonides, because like I said, there's no actual, people think that they're injecting ozone. They're not.
Hmm.
The ozone reacts so rapidly that what happens is you end up with a reduction oxidation reaction, right? So you've got
Hmm.
this redox process that happens, and it happens very, very rapidly. So you end up with these stabilized ozonides, which just have an unstable oxygen kicked off, just like ozone is O3 in lieu of O2. O2 being stable, O3 having this very, unstable capacity to want to pull off electrons and oxidize them.
Hmm.
So in that sense, we thought, well, okay, that's maybe a thing to do. And we kind of pondered the idea of like, well, going in and having autohemotherapy is sort of a pain in the ass because it takes, an hour and you have to sit there and have your blood drawn. And then the question came up when we were non-intuitive, could you do that in a pill? Is there a way you could take something in a
Yeah.
pill? And I mean, obviously, because it's like the convenient, easy way to do it. And so
Hmm.
I didn't know. And so I started looking at what had been done before. And one of the things I found was in the late 1800s, Tesla had made this portable ozone generator. And in the early 1900s, in 1904, he started a thing called the Tesla Ozone or Ozonated Oil Company. And it was literally, he was taking olive oil and he was bubbling ozone through it while it was above this bay of high strength magnetic field emitters.
Hmm.
And then the oil had all these magical healing properties. And I looked at it and I thought, well, okay, that seems reasonable. So I started looking at all the companies that are doing it today. And there were a fair amount of people that were making ozonated oil. But then I started talking to them and I said, okay, so what's the process? And they said, well, it takes 2.5 weeks and you ozonate the oil and it's kind of like a triple pass redox reaction. And everybody across the board was doing the same thing. And I was thinking, Tesla was really bright. He
Yeah.
probably would not have taken 8 weeks and had this very costly magnetic field array under these things if there wasn't a purpose. So I started thinking, why did he do that? And then it hit me that he was doing it because you're dealing with a polar molecule. And if you basically get them to move in alignment, you can kind of get everything going single file
Hmm.
rather than in sort of a chaotic structure. So he was actually, as the ozone bubbles through, the viscosity changes and it becomes, a more gel-like substance. And he was doing the very brilliant thing of actually aligning all of the molecules in a field force line so that he could get more active units per volume without them interacting and being spent. And
Hmm.
truly, it was brilliant. When I realized what he had done, I thought, holy cow, that cat was so far ahead of everybody else in his day. I mean, honestly, it must have been a little bit lonely to be that guy. He probably had like, three
I
or
mean,
four
if you
other
watch the
people.
documentaries on him, it just seems like he is a pretty lonely character in certain points. So,
Yeah, it really does seem like that.
mm.
I would imagine he probably didn't have a whole lot of people to interact with that really
Hmm.
got it. Um, so I looked at that and I thought, damn, that's great. I should do that. And then I thought, well, should I really do that? Because I did actually experimentally do it just to see if I could do it. And it wasn't that much of a trick. But then I thought, what would Tesla do if he were doing this today?
Hmm.
Because I've got 100 years of really cool physics knowledge and tech that wasn't around then. And I thought, I have an inkling. So then I started trying to figure out how I could break it down. And the farther I got, the more it actually, in terms of strength, actually started to approach being able to replace autohemotherapy. But you couldn't do it in a little dose just because the molecular interaction wasn't strong enough.
Hmm.
So then, and this borders on a bit esoteric, but it's just the reality of how it actually happened. There's a fellow named Barry Morgulin, who's a endoscopic surgeon, but
Hmm.
his real gig, everybody jokes about him as being kind of like Doctor Strange, and it's kind of accurate. He's a little bit on the far fringe of things, but we were at Paleo FX in 2019, and he did this thing that I didn't quite understand at the time. He opened a pack of protein powder and scooted it into two separate piles, and he put his hand above one of the piles for just a few seconds, and he said, "Taste it." And I tasted the regular one, normal protein powder. I tasted the pile that he had just held his hand over, and it was delicious, like absolutely amazing. I thought, that's incredible. There was no change in color, no change in heat, so there wasn't any thermal emission. Nothing had jumped to a different orbital shell. I didn't see any evidence of interaction. And I asked him, I said, what did you do? And he said, oh, I charged it with source energy. And which, you tell a scientist, I charged it with source
Yeah.
energy. It's
What was your reaction in that moment?
my reaction was I just tasted it. So either my taste buds have been hacked or there's something fundamentally different. So,
Hmm.
a lot of times I think good science generally stems from the idea that we don't, we're just operating on a map based on the technology we have at the moment. And science is really a function of something it's a construct locked in time. And so we're dealing with, 21st century science right now. And that doesn't really, it's not terribly descriptive. I mean, I know that if you went back 500 years and looked at the technology that we have now, you would be awestruck. And I think in the future, a lot of the things that seem fringy or spiritual, or, where you're dealing with quanta and things like that, they'll have a much better grasp on it because time will have progressed. We'll have tools to actually drill down and analyze it. In fact, some of the things that I've been working on lately, I can't actually analyze the effect of what I'm doing on the compounds. I have to go for a secondary effect. I have to look at what does it do to the blood,
Hmm.
like actually do dark field microscopy and say, okay, how is this changing? What does it actually look like? And when you see a hugely pronounced effect there, you can go back and go, okay, something's different. I don't yet know exactly what, but something's different. So in this case, I didn't know what the hell, I, imbued it with source energy really meant. And sadly, not wanting to seem the fool, I didn't actually grill him as to what exactly that meant. But I never lost sight of it because I could taste it, which meant I had receptors for it. And if you have receptors for it, then you can build something to test for it. And if you can
Hmm.
build something to test for it, even if, tangentially test for it, then you can start to kind of drill down through the periphery until you end up with something that you're affecting. And so
Hmm.
that's what I did. I started thinking, well, if there was no change in temperature, that knocks out an entire category of things that could have happened. And if there was no change in color, that knocks out an entire category of things that could happen. So then I started thinking, well, what else can you do? And there's all sorts of things like, people like Al Puthoff and guys like that look at, field effects and kind of the quantum field, the bubbling 0 point energy field. And there's a lot of really brilliant research in that sort of stuff. But I thought, well, okay, if I make this a model that I can just understand, I started thinking about the molecules as related to, say, kind of like the old Bohr model of the atom, just because it's easy. In my head, I started thinking about the nucleus and the sun, and then the planets and the orbital shells of the electrons. And I thought, well, you know, if you look at the confined energy in a system, right, and you go back and you start looking at how that's been done since 1924, basically when we started drilling down into how wave mechanics worked. Everybody looked at the confined energy in a system as something where, for the analogy I was just using, the confined energy are the planets revolving around the sun. Well, that's not actually the real oomph. The real oomph is the revolution of the planets, the rotation of the planets on their own axis, not, the revolution around the sun. And so I thought, well, you know, everything has spin, right? Bosonic and fermionic spin. So all things are moving. What if I entrained the spin? And then I started thinking about it. Well, okay, that would make sense because it would be, they're already spinning, but if I could make it coherent, then I could kind of quantize the energy in these different little packets and get everything moving at the same rate. And once I have them moving at the same rate, I should be able to use some sort of resonant function to bump up the energy levels. And so that's what I did, because if you get them spinning more rapidly and change the fundamentals of spin, then the confined energy in the system goes up, even though from the outside it appears exactly the same, which is what I had seen with, that protein powder. Was everything had the appearance of being exactly the same, but it was obviously fundamentally different. And so I started devising ways to do that and doing experiments around trying to see if I could amp up the energy in a system in terms of spin. And so eventually I came up with a way to do that. And then I thought, well, it's going to degrade. So I need to come up with a way to lock that in phase. And so then I started looking at holography and using pulsed lasers. And if you've ever watched how, someone makes a holographic plate, the thing that's really cool to me, at least, about a holographic plate is holograms. You hold up the plate and it looks just like a pretty image where you can kind of see through it, but all of the information is contained in every little piece of that. So if you shatter that plate and you have just one small piece, it contains all of the information for the entire system.
Hmm.
And the other thing that's really intriguing is that if you shine a light through it, you can see that 3D image. But if you shine coherent light through it, then you can actually get a perfect recreation of that thing down to subatomic scale. And so you really do lock in the information that's confined in that system. So I came up with an array to pump these things up and then make a gel, in this case, an ozonated oil, and use the gel as the storage medium. Because if you look at a glass plate, glass is an amorphous solid. It's not crystalline, so the structure isn't as defined as everyone thinks. And over, say, the time scale of 10, 15,000 years, you'd actually see it flowing down like a sheet of water that's out, that's in a different temporal scale. I mean,
Hmm.
if you can make a sheet of soap bubbles and watch them go down, or a sheet of water in the same, but you think of glass as this very fixed, stable thing. Well, it's only
Hmm.
very fixed and stable to us because we're locked in our own temporal scale.
Hmm.
If you extrapolate that out and start playing with something like femtosecond pulse lasers, the difference between water or a gel and a piece of glass is far less than the difference in the actual pacing of the laser firing. So
Hmm.
I basically made a holographic gel so that I could lock in, using dichroic beam splitters and the whole 9 yards, just like you would with any other sort of holography, lock in the information confined in that system and keep the states at that point. And that's what I did. And then, kind of the proof is in the pudding. If you take normal ozonated oil and you ingest it, you get one effect. And if you take, the stuff that is the Biocharged products and you ingest it, you get an entirely different effect.
Mm.
It's kind of, I say it goes to 11 because what you're in essence doing is turning up the volume of the molecule without changing the molecule.
Hmm.
And because when it has the interaction, you're not just looking at the one interaction. Because of the inherent energy in the system, it sets up a cascade, and that the impact of that reaction is far more pronounced. So
Hmm.
it's kind of like a blitzkrieg, right? There's not a whole lot going on, but when you ingest the thing, your body thinks that, oh my God, I'm experiencing this insanely large oxidative assault.
Hmm.
But you're not. But it doesn't know that, so it mobilizes, SOT2, glutathione, your body's endogenous antioxidant defense regimens, right? So
Hmm.
you propagate all these things up in response to this huge threat that's just occurred, and you get all the benefits of that. But the reality is, no giant threat has just occurred. It's just shifted your physiological perception of the event.
Hmm.
So kind of get the benefit without the detriment.
So, Ian, let's just recap. You just hit a big portion of the benefits of ozone um, there at the end. But just for people that are listening right now and are saying like, "Hey, this sounds really, really interesting, fascinating." Traditional ozone therapy, what do people use it for? And then you mentioned that you took it to an 11 with the biocharge. What are some of the effects or the feedbacks that you're getting right now from various users?
Well, actually, I would recommend anybody just go to the website. It's biocharged.co and look at the comments and people, or go, onto Instagram or, Facebook and look at the comments that people are putting up. But it's, it, historically, people would use ozone to knock out viral load.
Yeah.
If you were having mental issues, mental fog, something that you thought might be coming from, virus, bacteria, some sort of mold, you could use ozone, and it's really phenomenally good. You can do rectal insufflation, you can do autohemotherapy, you can do 10 pass. You can actually, I wouldn't recommend breathing it because it strips the
Yeah, that's one of the
yeah,
things that people say just don't do.
yeah, no, that's a really really bad idea,
Hmm.
just because of how reactive it is.
Hmm.
The benefit is also the detriment if used in the wrong capacity. So people are noticing their GI system gets kind of remodeled because your body. A lot of people say, well, oh, is it negatively impacting the healthy intestinal flora? And it would if it were having a direct interaction, but because it's going actually into the small intestine. It was, I used a delayed release capsule so that it would actually open in the small intestine so you could get it perfused into your blood and more systemic as opposed to localized. If everything opened just in your stomach, yeah, it could have an interaction with the healthy stuff, but it's really opening in your small intestine, and you're getting more systemic effect. So your body's own systems upregulate, and hence you're just giving yourself more energy. When you stimulate the mitochondria like that, because they get triggered thinking that there's this assault, So you have a mitochondrial upregulation, and you actually feel it. You start to get a little heat, which is kind of funny, just from the size, a third of a mil, is pretty tiny, but you can
Hmm.
actually take one capsule and feel yourself start flushing with heat, and that's because it's cranked up so that it has a much more pronounced impact. But because of that, that mitochondrial upregulation gives you more energy. It definitely has an effect on your GI system. And, if people have something like candida,
Yeah.
I tell them that they need to take binders with it because it really will eviscerate candida. And you can play with the dosing too. Typically, I just recommend that people just take one capsule because it's got enough oomph, but some people do two. I used to do just one, but in the past couple months, I've been doing two. And I take them on an empty stomach in the morning. And the reason for that is if you have anything in your stomach, it generally goes in and it stops in your stomach. And so you end up with the interaction there. And if you have something like candida, it can be a little uncomfortable because it causes such a rapid die off of the
Hmm.
candida that you really need to take binders and things like that, so you don't end up with headaches or feeling really bad. But like I was saying, you can play around with the delivery. Take it on an empty stomach. It's more of a systemic effect. If you do have candida and you want to take that out of the game, take it with a little food so it stays in your stomach, knocks out the candida. Really, you only need to do it for a few days. In fact, even things like Giardia parasites just get obliterated by this stuff.
Hmm.
You know, a couple days and you can knock out Giardia, which is honestly pretty fantastic. My mom had Giardia about a year ago.
Yeah.
But, unfortunately, I didn't have this at the time. So the medication they put her on was kind of disturbing, and it took quite a while. Live and learn, I suppose. So,
Okay. And so if I'm going to compare ozone delivery mechanisms here and just sort of, I'm one of those people that's evaluating, should I buy the €1,000 ozone machine versus taking this? Is there a difference in the effect that I would get from like rectal insufflation versus this, or is it sort of similar, if not better?
well, in terms of rectal insufflation, it's actually pretty similar if you take it on an empty stomach
Hmm.
because you're really getting it kind of to the same region.
Hmm.
And for me personally, I actually prefer the capsule as opposed to the rectal delivery method.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I
Much,
think most people
it,
listening to this would argue the same.
yeah. Now, in terms of efficacy, I wouldn't say that there's actually, depending on how you dose it, right? You can modulate it by taking more capsules or doing a longer period of insufflation at a higher ratio of the ozone to the air mixture. There's lots of ways you can vary it. For me, it's actually because I've done pretty much most of the methods. It's actually about convenience, and I think this is just such an easy thing to do. Also, you really don't have the risk. It eliminates when you're actually playing with ozone. If you miss the dosing,
Hmm.
you're pretty much tickled, right?
Yeah.
Because you're stripping mucosal membranes and you're having a direct molecular interaction with something that is literally stripping off electrons and oxidizing things. And
Mhm.
that can have some deleterious consequences, if you really don't know exactly what you're doing. I actually don't recommend that people buy. I mean, I've got 3 units, but I'd say go to somebody who does it all the time as
Yeah.
opposed to being a cowboy and trying to do it on your own. I mean, you can definitely do it if you're a biohacker. You're probably going to do it anyway. But it's better if the first time out of the gate, go to a doctor who does it all the time. It's
Yeah.
not that tricky to find a specialist, and it's only a couple $100.
Yeah.
For me personally, I like the ability to do it on a daily basis.
Hmm.
And it's pretty cheap. I mean, it's less than $50, and you get to do it on the daily, and it's just literally popping a pill before I do anything else in the morning. And you can feel it. It keeps me humming right along. So 10 pass, if you've got something systemically that's a big issue, 10 pass is better.
Hmm.
You're going to end up with a far more pronounced effect, and it's going to clean you out entirely. So there's not really much of a comparison. I don't literally the way I designed it. It's not something that you're going to replace, like 10 passes, and you
Hmm.
might approximate a fraction because it is equivalent to kind of like doing a pass. But the 10 pass is a much better system, and I've got a friend Matt Cook who does that in San Francisco, and
Yeah.
they have a tremendous amount of success doing that sort of thing.
Amazing. Ian, what I want to do, because this is just the first of many conversations you and I are going to have, lucky you. Um,
That's awesome, man. I love this.
and so what I want to do now is I want to transition into a few rapid fire questions,
Okay.
because at the end, I want to give people a shot to go out and find the Biocharged stuff. But first question is, let's start with this one. What excites you most about the health world right now?
Ooh, quantum medicine. That is what excites me the most. I think people are actually getting to the point where they're starting to look for effects in things that actually make a difference in lieu of kind of hacking around randomly. It's. I always go back to that Henry David Thoreau thing, and for every 1,000 hacking at the leaves of evil, there's one hacking at the root. Be
Hmm.
the guy hacking at the root. And in my estimation, quantum medicine and quantum biology, that's the root. That's where it's really at. It's the transition point where you go from kind of the ephemeral to the tangible, and also the point at which you can elicit the largest response with the least effort. So
Yeah,
that excites me. That actually excites the hell out of me.
I'm gonna write that down. Be the guy hacking at the root. That's a great quote. What is your top trick for enhancing focus? You mentioned you played around with all kinds of stuff before, but what's your top trick these days?
Single top trick is meditation.
Mm,
And so I do a couple of different things. I do actually Dr. Morgulin, Dr. B. I do his techniques. It's energy for success. So I follow his stuff, and then I also do TM and combination of those, and then I read voraciously.
mhm,
And when I say I read, as it pertains to focus, I read things that are specific to enhancing my capacity, which
mhm.
usually isn't things around mental performance. That's mental performance. I think is actually kind of a secondary effect. I think things that enhance your consciousness and make
Yeah.
your consciousness stronger have the net effect of bringing you up across all fields. And it's kind of the rising tide raises all ships.
Yeah.
And so I focus on things that really do have an impact. When you meditate, if you go into a deep state of meditation, you stimulate over 80% of your entire cerebral cortex. And the only way a guy can do that, is, in my opinion, you're either some tantric sex master or you're going to meditate, because the two times that occurs is if people are in a deep state of meditation or they've had an orgasm that's lasted more than 3 minutes. So
Mhm.
for me personally, not so much an option, but I don't have the I
It'd
don't
be a
have the
fun
equipment.
project to work on, right?
Right, but my hair would be consistently mussed up and I'd have a really dumb look on my face all day. um, yeah, so I think for me it's the acuity as a byproduct is staying focused and being perceptive is really all just about expanding my consciousness. The more I can do things like that, the more the effects are beneficial. I'd recommend anybody look at David Hawkins. I don't know if you've
Mhm.
ever looked
Yeah.
at his stuff. Power versus force. I subscribe to the idea that as your consciousness starts to expand, your brain restructures, and your capacity to do things and perceive things clearly gets enhanced. And
Yeah.
for me, the outcropping of being able to do all of these different fields is simply just the result of trying to shift my consciousness so that I can actually hold more in one shot. Because
Mhm.
a lot of the things that I've been able to develop are because I see interrelations and patterns in one field and relate it to another. When I was a kid, I mainlined this show called Connections. It
Yeah.
was from James Burke, the British journalist. And I still remember all those. And, every couple of years I'll go back and watch them. But it was this brilliant show because it just showed one concept and then it took it all the way back to its inception. And the thing I was left with was it was never a straight line, right? And so the idea of focus in our culture a lot of times is single pointed focus, which does have its necessities in some certain aspects. But
Mhm.
really, I think what you're trying to do is figure out how does enhanced focus benefit people. So my hack is look at it systemically and kind of a holistic approach. Up your consciousness and your focus and acuity will go up immeasurably. So,
Mm.
long answer.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you. Um, one Well, and second to last question here. Book which has most impacted your life.
Ooh, book that has most impacted my life. Um, The Razor's Edge, W. Somerset Maugham.
Oh,
Yeah.
Why that one in particular?
Um, because the idea that what you're focusing on may not actually be the thing that really has the most import to yourself and to humanity as a whole. And so the story there. I think when the protagonist really kind of gets it, as it were, he realizes that all of the things that he's been marching towards weren't necessarily the most pivotal or important things. And the idea that's very vexing to a lot of people is sometimes you can do everything just right and it still doesn't work. And sometimes you can do everything seemingly in an inappropriate fashion and everything comes together.
Hmm.
Um, it's looking at the reality that we're in through a different lens and realizing that as people, we're coming from a very small perspective. I mean, just in terms of the actual physics of it, we perceive something like 0.00001%
Hmm.
of reality, just in terms of the bandwidth of what we're able to pick up in terms of the EMF spectra. And so that's akin to, because I was trying to explain this to somebody, and that's akin to getting 1,000 square foot flat and having to assess the entire flat by looking at a square inch.
Hmm.
Can you really do that? Or where you are in Amsterdam, a 335-meter space, and you're able to look at, 2 square centimeters. Does that you're not going to have an accurate perspective, and so that the Razor's Edge kind of just drilled that down for me a little bit. At the time when I read it, I thought, okay, there's obviously more going on to reality than I'm perceiving. I need to adjust my awareness and try and perceive more, which that's when I really started trying to, learn meditation, things like that in my early 20s,
Hmm.
because I just knew that there was more going on than I was able to perceive. And so that was the hammer hitting the crystal at the exact right moment to cause it to cleave in the proper way. And it really launched me on a path where I started looking at other things. And just as a second, and I know you didn't ask, but as a second, actually, that book that I had referenced, Power versus Force by David Hawkins,
Yeah.
brilliant, just an absolutely brilliant tome. I wish more people had access to that and would look at it, because just in and of itself, it's a brilliant work. But what it's real overtones in terms of humanity and kind of looking out for one another, fantastic.
Yeah. I haven't delved that much into Power versus Force, but I've read Letting Go, which
Mm,
is also a fantastic book and highly recommend to both
yeah,
of them. Obviously, I'll check out Power versus Force though.
right on.
Uh, Ian, where can people find out more about you and Biocharge and everything that you're up to?
Well, let's see. So for Biocharge, just go to biocharged.co
Hmm.
and you can look at everything there. And then my own site, it's a bit clandestine, and I did this recently just in terms of getting a little bit more inquisitive responses from people going, "Ah, we want to know more about what you're doing." So I have a site, Mitchell Sciences, that people can look at, but I don't actually even know if it's up yet. I think it may just be under construction at the moment. Oddly enough, I'm not really terribly focused on that. I'm kind of spending my time trying to crack other puzzles that have a little bit more weight.
Yeah, I imagine of the problem set that you laid out earlier, this having your own website probably falls a little bit further down the
Yeah,
spectrum. So,
yeah, I do think it's neat when luckily people I'm not that hard to find. You can get me, Ian Mitchell one on Instagram and just hit me up with a DM or something like that. And
mhm.
I'm pretty accessible. It's not like a real cloistered ivory tower. So
Very cool. Ian, this is an absolute pleasure. And like I said, we're going to do
likewise,
this again soon. I hope we can do it again in person.
that would
Um,
be epic. I would love to do it in person. That would be
yeah.
great. Yeah, you're always welcome here. We can meet up in Colorado or DC or Amsterdam if travel ever opens up.
Yeah, I feel like I am coming your way sooner than you'll be coming mine, but
That's
we'll
probably true.
we'll make that happen either way. But thank you, my
Yeah,
friend.
man.
This has been an absolute pleasure.
Truly. Awesome. Thanks, Boomer.
And we'll link to all this stuff in the show notes, guys, but have an absolutely epic day.